Hello, hello. Today is Tuesday, November 7th. This is Booksy. We're going to be talking about AMC. I do not want to make this a long video. I'm going to do my best to keep it very, very quick. There's not a whole lot to talk about that's different from the previous video, so I don't want to get into it too much. But basically, what we have here is sort of like option 2. I think in the previous video, this is sort of how it ended, and I talked about how if we were going to see it kind of continue, it needed to break out of this wedge that was forming. I say wedge, but anytime we talk about stuff like this, you really should just think about this as just a narrowing range, a narrowing spread, meaning that the price action is getting tighter as it goes. We had this up thrust that went above the top of the range, and I say up thrust, but it's not really, because there wasn't any heavy volume in the sell-off. It just kind of went up high, which would lead me to think, okay, it's probably going to form an SOS. And in the previous video, I talked about how it looked like it came up high, and then it had this bizarre kind of slow, very methodical sell-off, and that if we wanted to see it break out immediately early in the week, we were going to need to see it come above 1117 and then push up again. But I had it drawn down first because I was thinking it needed to come down and retest that 1072 region, that 1073, which is very important. It's the bottom of this previous area. As a lot of people have pointed out, if you go back, it's near the bottom on the original all-time lows at this point in the chart, the way it's set up. I don't really care that much about that right now. We'll talk more about that later. But suffice to say, it needed to really come down first and then come up and find support. And then I had this other option, which was, hey, we go back down to roughly 10 and we camp down there. And this has to do with coming down to retest the intersection here of this creek and this creek. And you can see it, and it's essentially like intersecting right around 990. It's more or less what we see happening right now. I don't think, I'm with Stockfather on this one if you haven't caught his most recent video, because there wasn't really any big UT. And like normally when we sell off, there's like some kind of a massive spike with a heavy amount of selling. We saw heavy selling early this morning, but then it pretty much just dissipated. So it seemed like it was very targeted selling to me. Now this is a 4-hour chart, so you can see how that first half the day, just heavy selling. Second half the day, just kind of sat flat. And I think it's hovering right above that gap down at 10. There's another gap down below around 922. I did some Bukowski targets, and let's see if I can pull those up. Whoop, we don't want to talk about that just yet. Some of you are going to be like, oh my gosh, I could go back, like screenshot it or something. So I looked at the breakdowns if we were to break down here, and I did some Bukowski targets for that wedge. There's 2 targets, and not surprisingly, they're the gaps. I mean, it's very clean. In one target, you measure from the bottom of the wedge, which for us would be around 918 all the way to the top, wherever it is, around 1140 or whatever it was, and then you multiply by like 32%, and it gives you essentially like 990. I mean, it's right there, or just, I think it was like 1015. I don't even know. It was something like really close to the gap. And then the other one is it just retraces back down all the way to the bottom, which of course there's also a gap there. I didn't mention, I don't know if I mentioned this in the previous video, but these gaps that were created, there was 1, 2, 3, and then a fourth one right here that filled pretty fast. Each of those was about a 50% reduction from the next. So I did the math on it. There's a 27%. I did it to the floors because there's a gap up basically on each of these pop-ups. But I did it to the floors. You can see, and going all the way up to that 1073 floor right here, there's actually like a really clean, almost 50% reduction all the way up to the top. So with that being said, the RSI kind of coming down on that second push, it was pretty clear we were going to need to have some kind of a pullback. It's not impossible that this is like a cat ear and we just haven't seen the upthrust yet, that it's going to happen maybe. If I'm going to throw out like speculative things going into earnings, I would say that's a probable outcome. It's not impossible. I don't think it's like 50-50, but it does seem to be very possible that we have a massive amount of buy-in on an upthrust, and then we get a really significant sell-off. Normally, and I'm on the 4 hour, which is kind of zoomed out, and I know I said I'd keep this brief, so I'm going to keep it brief. Normally on like a 4 top, which some other folks might call different things, but I think this is basically it. I think you can see that the patterning here is sort of fits the bill. The only thing we might be missing is like that bigger hook. So if that were to happen into earnings, what I think that would look like is probably, and we'll have to watch out for this, but it would probably be retesting this particular line right here. So it would be essentially like, oh, maybe we come down and it chills out around 10 or a little lower, dip a little bit beneath here. You go down and retest this particular trend. Maybe it gets down to like 980 something, and then on earnings you see this big rip to the upside, and it comes all the way up, to 12, maybe even beyond. But if it were going to be an upthrust, I think it would probably come up to just a little bit higher here, and then maybe 1175 or something, and then it starts bleeding out to the downside, in which case you would be watching for that bigger breakdown of this channel here, this main outer channel line. We're not there yet. That hasn't happened, but that's what I would think the final upthrust might be if it's going to happen. Okay. Otherwise, I don't see any reason to be overly suspicious about this. I really think that if it can find support around 10, it's very possible that earnings, you have a big shakeout, and then you just kind of continue back up and go for the gap fill up near 13 or 13.5, something like that. And then after that point in time, maybe we'll see it come back down. I know that future rollovers is coming up on the 20th of November. It's not really like super newsworthy, but oftentimes we see some price movement into or out of that date. So that's another thing to keep in mind. It's a couple weeks out. I do want to do a video about possible downside, but we're not quite there yet. I want to make sure that we sort of see the possibilities going into earnings. And I know that it would be a kind of a bigger video to do. So I'm not going to do that right this second. I'll try to do it tomorrow, but tomorrow is kind of a busy day. I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version of it, which is basically that if we see this kind of redistribute like a little head and shoulder here, it ends up being like a 4 top on the cat ear. This could end up being actually the 4th ear over here. And what it would be is essentially like you get this up thrust. It's super gross. It looks really strong, but it's really like an up thrust, and then it bleeds out. And essentially, once you get to this point and you break down, I wouldn't say a free fall, but you'd definitely be going down pretty low. I think this is where I'm coming up with targets of like $6. And I know that's, again, that might seem a little bit out there for a lot of folks. I don't want to gloss over it too much, but I also don't want to like spend this whole video talking about it, because I think you need a little bit more, it needs a little bit more work, and I want to make sure it's really clear. So if I can pull that chart up, I will. Yeah, this is basically what I'm thinking. And I know it looks a little bit similar, like this kind of has it running up, but maybe it's something that happens after earnings. It doesn't really matter. Basically, this is just a drop with a bounce. And what this is, in essence, is a kind of a repeat of 2020's bottom, where you essentially like redistribute lower in order to go down and get that liquidity that was kind of not really messed with. There's a whole lot of theory behind why this might happen like this, and how this would look, and how the spring would basically be here, not where we thought it was here, and that this is more or less just a period of like head faking, essentially. So if we were to see something like this after earnings with like a big spike to the upside or something like that, just know that like I'm on it and I will address it. if we get this kind of move where it jumps way up and then comes crashing back down, definitely possible. Or if you see that drop and that recovery and it hooks here, it's definitely possible we're in more of this scenario, and I'll get on it. I've done a lot of work on this, surprisingly, for what it is, because it's basically just theory at this point. But it's a concept of like how we essentially get to eventually get to like these higher numbers, and doing it in a way that kind of deceives everybody that it's going to run, and then really goes back for the low liquidity that was left behind, and then ends up camping out on top here, underneath underneath 16. And if you remember, Ape being like that, had that $1.64 liquid center. So I think camping underneath that actually kind of makes sense, and then doing a secondary push where it's like a 50-50 move up above to 23. And I know it seems a little out there. It seems kind of like, why would it wait that long? Like, it just seems like crazy. But I went through this very methodically, and this doesn't mean that it's true. It's just something to think about for me right now. I went through this like super methodically and like thought about exactly like how the timing might work based on trajectories and all this other stuff, and patterning and all this stuff. And it turns out that way over here, like in March of 2024, there's a really critical intersection of, which is where I ended up kind of at this 50-50. There's this really critical intersection, and I can't explain all these lines. They're all pretty specific, but it's a pretty critical intersection of these particular trends, these blue ones coming up. Those are really important. Again, I'd have to go through it all. And then these two particular intersections as well, and those are basically like your creeks, your major creeks, I think, intersecting there. So it's a really strange concept, and it's not my favorite because it would take a really long time, obviously, but it seems right to me for a lot of reasons. So I'm gonna take more time to do a video like this, but I just want to throw it out there in case earnings ends up doing something crazy, Thursday into Friday, Friday into Monday. Just let you know that there's a $6 target in my view. If we end up going up and gap filling, this doesn't necessarily go out the window, because technically, like, this could just be higher and still come back down. But so, like, I guess what I'm trying to say is it doesn't necessarily affect the next 2 days. And it doesn't necessarily even affect much of anything, even if we went up to 13. And I know a lot of people are going to be like immediately like, well, no, that'll never happen. But yeah, you never know. I mean, nothing's impossible in the market. And the way this has been set up is strangely like conducive to this kind of movement back to the downside. So I think there's a strong argument there. Anyways, I'm going to leave it at that, though. I don't want to go too long. It's already been like 13 minutes, so I'm going to leave it at that. I probably won't stream tomorrow. I might, if I have time, try to do it. Big thing here is just, I think that it's more likely that we're going to kind of coast down and fill out this gap and then recover a little bit going into earnings. If you see some kind of a major move to the upside after this, I can't tell you what to do financially. I know that right now I'm feeling more bullish going into earnings because we're really close to this $10 gap. I don't think we're just going to tank straight down to this lower gap, but it's obviously not out of the question. And if that something like that did happen, it would make sense that this would be some kind of a mirrored head and shoulder pattern. So I still think, kind of watching tomorrow's price action. I think if you see this come back up tomorrow and become really high going into after hours, that could be a possible negative sign. Whereas if it stays kind of lower, that could be more positive for like a bullish, move after the fact. I'm not saying that's always the case, but AMC really likes to pivot around earnings and just do a really hard reversal before moving in the direction it's going to move. So just keep that in mind. I hope you all have a great one, and I will talk to you later.